Lead us not into temptation. That's something that we are taught to pray by Jesus. But many have never noticed this. It's weird, right? Like, why are we asking God not to lead us into temptation? Why are you doing that to us in the first place?
Now, I don't know about you when you read this, but two things immediately jump out to me when I do. First, why are we worried about God leading us into temptation in the first place? The second, is Jesus really talking here about the devil? Well, both of these deserve some of our attention, but let's start with the first question. Why would God be leading us into temptation? I mean, if God is always forgiving and desperately wants us to know ourselves as forgiven, everything we talked about last week, why, God, are you now trying to trip us up? And this has actually been a point of debate for a very long time. However, let's start by noticing here that there is a somewhat logical progression in the prayer. Last week was all about past sins, forgiveness and forgivenness. So it does make some sense that the next line would address future sins, or at least the possibility of avoiding them. The question, though, is why is God the one tempting us to go back to the sins we were just forgiven for? Because at least in the way it's constructed in English, the blame here seems to be on God. And that brings up a very thorny question called theodicy. In a world created by a good God, where does bad even come from? Why are you and I tempted to do anything that's hurtful? And what's interesting is the scriptures give us a lot of conflicting answers here. James comes right out and tells us, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does God tempt anyone. I mean, that seems pretty definitive. God is not tempting you. And most of us think that James is probably referring here to a text that's called Sirach, or sometimes Ecclesiasticus. Sometimes it's also known by the author, Yeshua Eliezer ben Sirah. But this was a Jewish text written about 200 years before Jesus, and you will find it in the Old Testament of Catholic and some Orthodox Bibles. And in it, Ben Sirah writes, "Do not say, it was the Lord's doing that I fell away, for God does not do what God hates. Do not say, it was the Lord that led me astray, for God has no need of the sinful. It was God who created humans in the beginning, and God left them in the power of their own inclinations. If you choose, you can keep the commandments. To act faithfully is a matter of choice. God has placed before you both fire and water, so stretch out your hand and choose whichever you want." So James and Ben Sirah seem to be saying quite clearly here, God is not in the temptation game. Fire or water, the choice is yours alone. Paul takes a slightly different approach. He writes in 1 Corinthians 10 that no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you're tempted, God will also provide a way out so you can endure it. So, where James is more direct, God is not tempting you, end of story. Paul opens the door maybe just a crack by suggesting, well, God might not be tempting you technically, but God is the one who allows you to be tempted. And this is consistent with the wisdom literature of the Hebrew scriptures, which go even farther than that, the most famous example being the book of Job. And there we find God essentially negotiating with the devil about the temptation of our boy. And importantly, the bottom line here, though, is there is no coherent, definitive answer in the Bible about where temptation comes from. You got James and Ben Sirah saying, God's nothing to do with it. Don't blame God. You got Paul opening the door a crack. You got Job on the other side saying God's negotiating with devils, opening the door to say God at the very least allows temptation in your life. But I think it's fair to say that all of them tend to agree, at least on this idea, that God is not directly the one tempting anyone, which then still leaves us with some difficulty in how to understand this line, God, lead us not into temptation. Well, way back, born in the 1st century, Marcion of Sinope suggested we should read this line, do not allow us to be dragged into temptation. And then Tertullian in the 2nd century suggested we should read this line, do not leave us in temptation. Later, the French theologian Jean Carmignac argued that the verb translated here, lead, is more accurately bring, which, by the way, is true. So maybe we should read this, do not let us be brought into temptation. And that actually became quite influential. So influential, in fact, that a few years ago, the official Catholic French translation of the Bible was changed to read that way. Pope Francis even put out a statement at the time approving the change, saying, the French have changed the text. And their translation now says, don't let me fall into temptation. This is because it's always me who falls, never God who pushes. A father doesn't do that. A father helps you get up. What leads me away is evil. That's very much in line with historic Catholic teaching. Paragraph 2846 of the Catechism says, God cannot tempt us. On the contrary, God wants to set us free. And so we ask God not to stand by as we take the way that leads to sin.